Hello and welcome to another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop. This time round we're featuring a car that I wasn't really expecting to feature actually, but we had so many comments about it lurking around in the background that, well, here it is, we're doing a video on it. And that's the Saab 900 Turbo 16S. And this is quite an interesting car actually in automotive history, because Saab at that time, when this car was made in the 70s, I'm pretty sure were sort of still part of the group that made the aircraft as well. And Saab made great play at this time about how sort of well engineered their cars were, and it wasn't all froth and fluff, it was genuine. Their cars were extremely well engineered. And the aircraft analogy was something that they bought into. There were direct influences. And Saab and BMW really led the charge amongst European car manufacturers at the time. In fact, they were, I would say, the first people in the world to really think about an ergonomic dashboard and control layout. And BMW, the first car that springs to mind was the first 6 Series BMW, maybe, and the 7 Series that followed shortly afterwards. And Saab, of course, made big play about this, making it sort of like an aircraft cockpit, so that you could have everything in a sort of arc in front of you, and there's a photograph here of that. The car itself is an interesting car. I mean, by 1970 standards, it was sort of mid-range heaviness. We've got so much safety kit and emissions kit on cars now, internal combustion engine cars, but they're really heavy and lardy these days. This car comes in at around about 1250, 1300 kilos, which is the same as, for example, a first generation 986 Porsche Boxster S, which is hardly a heavy car really. Or a modern day Mini is about 1250 kilos in sort of Cooper S trim or Works trim. So not a particularly heavy car for a mid-range saloon, but very, very solid. The whole thing is really, really well bolted together. And much like I did in the last Mercedes SL video, the 107, this car has got really, really solid bank vault doors. And that's not made by adding sound insulation panels or engineering in things to make it sound good when actually it's really tinny. It's genuinely a solid car. These things are built like a battleship. Try doing that on a modern car. It's good thick steel it's made out of, and they were tremendously safe in terms of crash protection, all sorts of things. But the really, really interesting bit about this was it's the predecessor, the 99. Much of this car is Saab 99. The 900 was a revised and updated 99. The 99 was the third European production car to have a turbocharger. The Americans experimented, Oldsmobile experimented, they called it the Jetfire engine. They put a turbocharger on an engine as early as 1962. Big turbos have been around since the 1930s, but the first application on a road car was 62 by Oldsmobile, and the engine was called a Jetfire. And they used a methanol and water mix to try and keep the detonation, the pinking, under control, because it was quite a high compression engine to start with. And obviously people didn't realize that in order to get the whole thing to work properly, you had to lower the compression ratio so that the engine didn't blow its brains out when the turbo came on boost. So that didn't really go very well. Oldsmobile dropped it very quickly. And then there was a second attempt by the US, which is great. That was sort of pushing the boundaries, but it still didn't quite work. And the first real road car that it worked on was the BMW 2002 Turbo. Again, it wasn't a fantastically refined system. The turbo was quite a heavy unit. They hadn't got round the trickery of dump valves and getting it to spool up and all sorts of things like that. Result was lots of turbo lag. Put your foot down, wait 2 seconds and bang, you're off. Which is interesting mid-corner. I've actually had it happen to me in a Porsche 911 Turbo on one occasion. And I think the steering wheel was there and I was there coming out of the bend at about 90 miles an hour just to keep the thing stable, because the turbo started cutting in halfway around a sweeping bend on a motorway turn at about 65, 70 miles an hour. Interesting old-fashioned turbos, but amusing and certainly focus the mind and take your mind off everyday worries if you happen to be driving one at the time. But Saab was far more, there was none of that layeriness with Saab. The turbos were great. They did suffer with lag, but they came up with all sorts of whizzy systems. APC was a system that they used to control the boost, to regulate the boost. They were, I think, the first manufacturer that actually brought in a turbo regulating system to try and tame it and keep it pre-spooled up and things like that. Porsche made a great success of it, in spite of what I was saying about the fact that it's so leery and tail happy. The early 911 turbo, the 3 litre, is great with the turbos strapped on it. Fantastic bit of kit. You've just got to be really careful of that handling and don't take your foot off halfway around a corner, otherwise you will be backwards into the scenery. Anyway, Saab, brilliant, really fantastic first effort by them. They sort of stood back and watched everybody else, i.e. BMW and Porsche, do it for the first 2 years. In '78, the 99 came out. And this car, as I say, is the development of it. Great car, really quite rare now. The engine started off as a Triumph Dolomite 1850 engine, single overhead cam. That engine got developed into the Triumph Stag V8, which was a very troublesome engine, cooling and timing chain issues mainly. And when you tried to come and take the cylinder head off one, it wasn't pretty. Generally, the Triumph 4-cylinder 1850 engine wasn't that reliable. It was okay, but for some reason, and I don't know why, I genuinely am at a loss to know why. Maybe Saab had extremely stringent quality control or something, but the engines were actually far more reliable in the Saab, the Triumph 1850 engine, than it was in the Triumph. They turned the whole thing back to front, so the front of the engine's here, back's there. This is an automatic. Very unusual. So it's driving through a torque converter to the automatic gearbox underneath, but the whole thing just works really well. The handbrake works on the front brakes, which is really unusual as well. The Citroen CX, I think, is one of the few other cars where that happens. And rather cleverly, they use the calipers on the discs with the handbrake mechanism, as many cars do. But the inner pad, the inner brake pad, is a different material to the outer brake pad, so that the handbrake actually works better at parking speeds and when the car stood still. Very, very clever. But they also made it so that it didn't wear out prematurely. I mean, really, really clever engineering at work. So I'm going to take this car for a run. We've done a couple of jobs on it. There was an O-ring on the distributor, which was leaking oil. A couple of other bits. We've changed the radiator thermostatic switch because that was cutting in and flattening the battery all the time. And we've also managed to get a new coolant expansion tank because the old one was pretty grotty looking and not very pretty. And I think it was about £45 or something. I mean, you buy a coolant expansion tank for almost any other car in this workshop, you can at least add another decimal point there, I would have thought. So I'm going to take this car for a run. We'll just have a look at a couple of bits around turbochargers, where they are, how they came to be, and yeah, we'll move on. Well, the turbocharger is one of those few instances in life where you almost get something for nothing. It's not often in life that you do. There's no such thing as a free lunch. But with the turbo, it was sort of a win-win situation, and it still is, which is why even Ferrari with the 488 have sort of broken one of their own cardinal rules, which is we won't have an everyday road car with a turbocharged engine. But I mean, they're still managing to do normally aspirated V12s, but the V8 has gone over to turbocharging now. And the reason is efficiency. If you have for instance, a 2-litre engine, which these days could, without a turbo, probably develop 200 brake horsepower, by putting this in within the engine infrastructure, you get power for free, in a sense. The turbine, the inlet is there, so the exhaust gases come out of the engine, into here, into this volute, spin the turbo round, and the exhaust gases come out of there. This one is actually off a 2-litre BMW, and it's electronically regulated, so it actually has a unit here which controls the angle of the vanes inside the gas-driven bit of the turbo. So it's two spools, two cyclones on a single shaft joined together. The exhaust drives that end, which comes through and drives the inlet. Very, very simple. In the old days, what you had was a wastegate, as it was called. Once the engine developed a certain point, a boost, the wastegate valve would open, and instead of the exhaust gases coming in round the turbo, it would bypass them, either to atmosphere or into the exhaust system. And the reason for that is to stop the turbo overspeeding. When you chip a car these days, one of the tricks that people do is to actually slightly overspeed the turbo above production speeds. And it's very important that you don't overspeed the turbo. Obviously, manufacturers build a margin in, so that's okay. But bear in mind, a turbo, when it's actually spinning and spooled up, it can be spinning up to 250,000 RPM, which is about 10 times as fast as a jet engine, and however many, 100 times as fast as your washing machine on full spin, or 200 times. So it's seriously moving, this tiny thing. The inlet here, it's critical that no foreign bodies, any dust or any particles or any bits of air filter or anything get in there. Because it's turning so fast, and this is such a delicate turbine, if it does hit it, it's instant death for the turbo. It just smashes the whole thing to pieces. And once you get something off a blade, it goes out of balance all of a sudden, and it wrecks the bearings. Just instantly, in a nanosecond, you've gone from healthy turbo to very dead turbo. So it's very important that you make sure that there's nothing can get in the inlet tract here. Nothing at all. The way this works, because this is a later turbo, we got two here. This one's electronically regulated. This is off a BMW 2-litre. This is a standard sort of turbo that's fitted to 2-litre diesel Golfs and Seats and Skodas and things. You'll notice that this has got a little vacuum unit here, which regulates the lever here. And what's happening there is it's actually altering the angle of the blades on the exhaust side of the turbocharger. So they can either be feathered so that the exhaust gases are hardly moving the turbo at all, or they can be coarse so that the exhaust valves are hitting it and spinning it super quick. And that's regulated, the actual angle of the blades is regulated by this vacuum module, which is controlled by the ECU. Very simple system. Again, you've got the inlet there, which is tiny, but bearing in mind a diesel VW engine now can be, what are they up to? 260 brake horsepower, something like that? Well north of 200 anyway. So the turbo has changed a little bit. First generation, wastegate controlled. Second generation, this vacuum unit. And third generation, this sort of electronic control system. But the one on the Saab has got the wastegate because it's a 1970s type turbo. But Saab really are to be congratulated on this car. They just got so much right with it. They really did. So let's take it for a run. Yeah, out on the road, the one thing that this car oozes, not only when it's standing still, but when you're driving it, is character. It's just got something that modern cars don't have. It's all really quirky. You've got the, everything is to hand, of course, just like a modern car. As I mentioned earlier, this has sort of paved the way for ergonomics as they are now. But it's just, everything's solid. All these controls are really solid. And even the horn is just fantastically Scandinavian. And it's very sure-footed, this car. Of course, it's built for extremely harsh winters. The heater's great. The road holding in particular is very sure-footed. For a car of the 1970s, as essentially it is, even though this is a 1989 car, and it just, it just wafts along. That turbo's just coming in nicely, just upshifting to third gear. Again, as is usual with cars of this age, I'm doing an indicated 60 miles an hour there, and the engine's doing 2,900 RPM, which is very high, really, but you know what, it's quite refined, you don't notice it, really. It's not ridiculously thirsty on fuel. this engine, when you consider how little you would use this car. It's not as if you're going to be piling 30,000 miles a year on it, I wouldn't have thought, although it would probably take it. But yeah, it just feels really of a piece. It's planted, that sure-footedness that front-wheel drive brings. Yeah, just a really, really nice package. Yeah, so I've warmed it through now. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, you will notice that the fuel gauge isn't working. We need to fix that. That's not going to be too challenging. But other than that, everything works. And there she goes. It just does it. It's effortless. Considering it's only a 2-litre engine, as I was saying earlier, the value for money you get, quote unquote, out of a turbocharged engine is the fact that while the engine is not working the turbo hard, while it's just cruising, the turbo isn't really working, it's just freewheeling with the exhaust gases. So the amount of energy that the engine is actually expending working the turbo is negligible. But when you do accelerate, it's there. That's why turbocharged engines are so attractive. It's almost like you do get something for nothing. Bearing in mind how little time you spend with your foot on the floor or demanding great loads of an engine, in road use these days, particularly with the traffic, it's very difficult to, in fact this heat is so good I'm going to have to turn it down because it isn't -10 outside. What's the percentage where we're actually using the turbo in earnest? 5%? 10% maximum? You know, it's there when you need it, but it's not when you don't. That's the beauty of them. It just freewheels in the breeze of the exhaust. Great. It's a win-win. We'll just kick it down again, and there she goes. Not the most pleasant noise in the world, it has to be said. The funny thing about 4-cylinder Saabs of this era is they don't sound very nice. They're like 4-cylinder Mercedes engines, petrol engines. They sound quite clanky and mechanical, if I can put it that way, but they last a long time. I mean, this engine is almost unburstable. The model above this, the Carlson, was nearer 200 brake horsepower. They then went on to the later turbocharged engines, which developed more power again. But yeah, it doesn't sound very pretty, but it does everything so well. One of the big problems with cars of this era that did develop reasonable power, and I would put this car in that category, was torque steer, where when you put the power down to the front wheels, it would try and wrench the wheel out your hands and try and self-center the steering. And it was something that couldn't be avoided because the know-how wasn't there to deal with it. The electronic traction and road holding aids weren't there. But this car manages very well. It really does. It's not trying to wrench the wheel out your hands when you accelerate. It's all very calm, really, which again is a tribute to how well Saab engineered this car. This was the start of a driveline that really began to work very, very well. The combination of a turbo and an automatic gearbox is really a perfect blend, because an automatic gearbox relies on an engine's torque to get things going. You have the torque multiplication, as it's called, of the torque converter, and that helps the car to get away off the mark quickly. But the turbocharger sort of kicks in, comes on, starts spooling up and giving boost once the engine's off idle and under some load, and that's just when the automatic gearbox is beginning to work at its best. So the two of them together actually give a very pleasing effect. It's quite difficult to explain, but if I was driving a Bentley, I would call it waftability, because that's what the effect is. Old Bentley turbos, like the Turbo R I reviewed a few videos ago, talked about it had a big turbo, and it sort of just started to spool up as the automatic gearbox was doing its thing. And this is the same. I mean, I'm barely touching the throttle there, and the car's accelerating quite respectably, and it's all just working. It upshifts to the next gear. The turbo is still giving plenty of boost. It's a very pleasing and relaxed effect. One of the things that's quite sort of wearing about modern cars is the fact that if they have a multi-gear automatic transmission, they're constantly hunting through the gears. And while you're not aware of it because the driveline's quite well refined, it doesn't give a very relaxing effect when the thing's searching between 7, 6, 5, 4, then up to 5, 6, then down to 3, 2. Automatic gearboxes these days are all over the place because they're constantly searching for the optimum. This is a 3-speed, and it's just always in the right gear at the right time. Again, it's a car you could, if you were a classic car enthusiast, you could go touring in this car. It's got bags of luggage space. You can fit 4 adults in it very comfortably. It's got a nice electric sunroof, which works very well. Good heating and ventilation system, no air conditioning. I don't even think you could get it as an option on this car at this age, maybe. But you know, automatic gearbox, just a really, really nice, pleasing, all-round package, this car, again. Well, there we are. That's the end of another Tyrrell's Classic Workshop video. Thanks very much for watching. Please subscribe, please share, please like, and we'll be back soon.